Okay, so today we're going to work with Islam in Asia. And there are a number of things about the religion of Islam particular to its being in Asia. The context of Asia, the countries, and the civilizations have had an effect on the way Islam is practiced, and also an effect on the way people of Asia see Islam. Okay. And the book begins by talking about Islam to begin with in terms of its coming into Asia. And as far as we can tell, the first appearance of Islam was in the year 711 of the Common Era, in the area which is now part of Pakistan. Also, after 1000 CE, we have an influx of both Muslim traders, economic, excuse me, economic interaction, and also an influx of Sufi mystics. Now, I think we mentioned before, if not, we'll mention it now, that Sufis are the group within Islam that are specifically interested in mystical experience of Allah, of the divine. And they bring this about in a number of different ways, and we'll talk about them later. The Emperor Akbar, who lives from 1556 to 1605, embraces and expands Muslim rule in South Asia. There are also in South Asia Arabs in the area who were there before the introduction of Islam. So the introduction of Islam in Southeast Asia had a ready-made audience, at least in terms of a common background and a common ethnic orientation. Sufi mystics encourage toleration and incorporation of Hindu and Buddhist elements in Indonesian Islam. And one of the chapters that you're assigned for this particular chapter in Esposito deals with that to a little bit of an extent. It is an example of some of the ways in which Buddhist or Hindu practices or perspectives have come in to the practice of Islam, and how that has been to some extent controversial. And we'll also see that in some of the videos. After this, a more orthodox Islam influence is felt, and that orthodox Islamic influence is very important to the present day. And I want you to view a video at this point. It's called Inside Pakistan's Sufism. And as we have done in the past, it is on canvas on the page for Chapter 7 of Esposito. This video lasts about 9 minutes, so I will ask us to come back at 25 after 4, and I will pause the recording during this time. Okay. The next part of the book tries to talk about how Islam begins and give a brief overview of its historical origins in terms of pre-modern Islam. The book does talk about the early years of the Prophet Muhammad. This is the formative period of Islam, and it is also considered the purest and most authentic Islamic community. And to some extent, that fits with other religious traditions as well. In Christianity, you have various groups who consider that the first century of Christian tradition was actually the best and actually the most authentic expression of Christianity. So that's not an uncommon move to see the earliest period as the most authentic. Muhammad is born about 570 into a tribal culture, which is marked by frequent warfare and tribal polytheism. Okay, think about that for a minute. There are these different tribes that are interacting with each other, oftentimes in conflict, oftentimes in war, and most of them ascribe to a polytheism in which there are a number of different gods and goddesses. Around the age of 30, by the age of 30, he was a respected and trusted businessman in Mecca. And at 46 or 40 rather, he receives his first message or revelation. And these messages continue for a span of 22 years. Those messages, those revelations he receives, are later written down and edited into what becomes the Quran. And that editing chooses, for example, which revelations might be more authentic than others and so forth. Okay. Muhammad sets out to reform society, especially the polytheism that is prevalent within it. He preaches for social justice and against socioeconomic inequities. And this leads to harsh persecution. Now, part of what's going on here is that Mecca was already a pilgrimage site. The Kaaba, the holiest place in Mecca, was already considered a holy place for polytheism, for the worship of different gods. And Mecca itself then was a chosen destination for pilgrims, which of course gave a good and very important support to the economy of Mecca. So what happens if you got this guy coming in, and we have been having great business with all of these different people, buying all of these different souvenirs of all of these different gods and goddesses, and they have to have a place to sleep, they have to have food, and all of that really supports our economy. The understanding that all these people come to worship all these different gods and goddesses. And Muhammad says, no, there's only one God. Well, that's a threat to Mecca's economic stability. Because if there's only one God, all of these pilgrims aren't going to come here anymore. And they aren't going to have to eat in our restaurants. They aren't going to have to sleep in our inns. They aren't going to have to support our economy. So part of his persecution was an understanding of the economic impact that changing to believe in one God would have on this already popular destination for pilgrims of polytheism. After 10 years, Muhammad, with the people who have become his disciples, emigrates to Yathrib, which becomes the city of Medina. This happens in 622. And the original name of this town was Medina. And the emigration of the emigration of Muhammad and his group is called the Hijra. That becomes important later. After 622, one of the things that's unusual is that the Islamic calendar does not begin the year Muhammad is born. It begins when they move from Mecca to what becomes Medina. 622 then becomes the Islamic calendar's year 1. And Muhammad again proclaims monotheism, rejecting polytheism and what he terms idolatry. He teaches that submission to God is both an individual and a community obligation. One point to notice is that the word Islam means submission, means accepting the fact that you are in submission, you are in a hierarchy with God. Islam becomes the primary source of community solidarity rather than tribe. Okay, so Medina has already welcomed Muhammad. In fact, before Muhammad emigrates, they say to him, come here and establish your faith. So he does, and Medina itself is renamed in honor of Muhammad and in honor of Islam. And thus, Medina becomes the first community of Islam, the first city that embraces Islam totally. And thus it becomes a source of community solidarity. Now, part of what this does is that it undercuts tribal loyalties. And when you have warring tribes, all of a sudden the tribe is not the most important thing about you. The most important thing about you is that you are a member of the Islamic tradition. And so the war between the tribes, at least in Medina, it stops, because instead of tribal allegiance, there is allegiance to Islam. In 1 decade, 10 years, Muhammad forges Islamic identity, consolidates a political base in Medina, and establishes basic religious law and practice. He does use and advocate to some extent both force and diplomacy to unite different tribes under the banner of Islam. Okay, any questions or comments here? And I see none in chat, so we'll go on. In terms of the Quran itself, a couple of things to mention about it. In Islamic tradition, it is considered the eternal, literal, and final word of God revealed to Muhammad for all humankind. Now, part of what the final word of God means is that in Islamic tradition, they believe that there was revelation to Abraham, and that the Jewish faith preserves at least some of that revelation. There was revelation to Jesus, and the Christian faith preserves at least some of that revelation. So God has already revealed things to Abraham, to Jesus, and according to Islam, now to Muhammad. And according to that faith, this is the last revelation. Muhammad is the final prophet. There will be no more prophets like Abraham, Jesus, and Muhammad. Also, the Quran is considered to be an eternal book. And this goes up to the next point. In terms of how it came to be, the written Quran on earth was taken from a tablet written in Arabic that pre-existed with God in heaven. Okay, so think about that for a moment. The Quran itself is considered to be a reflection of something eternal that already existed with God. And importantly, it is taken from an Arabic tablet. And that will you'll see the importance of that in a few moments. In the Quran, Moses and Jesus, I thought it was Abraham, Moses and Jesus retain a special place as prophets. So ignore part of what I said earlier. It was a revelation to Moses and a revelation to Jesus, and then a revelation to Muhammad. The Quran does accept and affirm that Jesus was born of a virgin. However, there are other traditional items in the life of Jesus that the Quran does not affirm. They do not believe, for example, that Jesus was God incarnate. He was simply a prophet, like Moses and like Muhammad. Okay. The language of the Quran is Arabic, period. And that reflects the teaching that the Quran is taken from a tablet in heaven that is in Arabic. And part of what this means, there are a few things about this. Part of what this means is that you cannot truly translate the Quran into any other language. You can only approximate the teaching of the the words of the Quran, because you can't fully understand it unless you understand it in Arabic. Another piece of this is the fact that the Quran itself, the Arabic of it, is very sophisticated and very beautiful in the way that the words come together and the way in which the words are poetically measured. And so you can't do that in English. You can't translate a poem from another language into English and have it be the same effect. Okay. Moving on to the differences between Sunni and Shia Islam. After Muhammad, the death of Muhammad creates a crisis, and dissent among the Islamic people, and also eventually civil wars that are all based on who should succeed Muhammad and what that person should do and how that person should be revered. The problem of succession. The majority of Islam, the Sunni, believes that the caliph, the leader, is elected and only serves as a political and military leader rather than a religious leader, rather than a religious authority. The Shia, they were always a minority, but they believe that the Imam, the leader, must be a direct descendant of Muhammad's family, and in addition to being a political and military leader, is also a religious leader. Now, note here, the term Imam is used differently in different groups. Among the Sunni and other groups of Islam, an Imam is the leader of a mosque, and thus you can have hundreds of imams in one city. The Shia, however, say that the true Imam is over all of Islam, and that person must be a direct descendant of Muhammad. Okay, in terms of Islamic law and mysticism, Islamic law stems from a number of sources. The first source, of course, is the Quran. But of course, after the Quran is written down, after Muhammad dies, various questions arise, moral questions, that are not covered in the Quran. For example, what does the Quran say about how you should drive a car? It doesn't say anything because the car didn't exist. But still, you have to come up with moral and religious laws and guidelines for modern things and for other things that have come into being after the Quran. And so in addition to the Quran, Islamic law can stem from the Sunnah, which is a collection of stories, hadith, about Muhammad's words and actions. So for example, again, let's say the Quran doesn't say anything about a car, but the Sunnah talks about how Muhammad treated his horse, and about how Muhammad cared for the horse, and how Muhammad rode the horse very respectfully of others. And so what you do is, okay, well, Muhammad's actions and words about the horse might apply to how we are supposed to use a car. And that also gets into what is called qiyas, or analogical reasoning. Muhammad's actions on the horse, there are similarities between that kind of dealing, that kind of doing, and cars. A horse gets you from one place to another, a car gets you from one place to another. A horse has certain needs and necessities, a car has certain needs and necessities, and so on. So Islamic law can come from the Quran, from the stories about Muhammad's words and actions, and from reasoning, thinking about similarities between situations. Another source of Islamic law has to do with ijma, or consensus. And what this means is that, okay, we have a situation that is not covered in the Quran. There's no story that really relates to it, so we can't use the stories or qiyas. What are we going to do? Well, this would be similar to the precedent in American law. We don't know what the Quran would say. We don't have a story about it. We can't reason from a story. But we've been living with this situation for a number of years. And most Islamic communities have come to a consensus about it. And so the consensus of the community, what the community has decided and has been doing, also becomes a source for Islamic law. Okay, are there questions at this point? Any chat persons? Okay. All right. Finally, the 5 pillars of Islam do provide unity of practice within the diversity of the community. And thus, we're going to talk about the 5 pillars. The 5 pillars are these. First of all, the declaration of faith. And that is simply saying with the intention of embracing Islam a particular verse. Okay, if you want to become a Muslim, all you have to do, technically, is to say, there is one God, Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet. But you have to say that sincerely, totally sincerely, and with the express intention of becoming a Muslim. So the fact that I just said it doesn't make me a Muslim. But if I decided to become a Muslim and said it, then I would be a Muslim. The second of the 5 pillars is prayer. And Islam traditionally requires you to pray 5 times during the day. And there are particular traditions about how this prayer is to work. And I have another video I'd like you to look at. This video also lasts about 9 minutes. And let's see here, stop this share. And we'll go to another share. Where are we? Yeah. Okay, we'll share this. This is on the page for Esposito Chapter 7. And I want you to look at this second video called Islam in Malaysia. And this will give you a demonstration about how some of this prayer happens. And thus, while you're watching it, I will pause the recording. Okay, so we'll go back to the slideshow because I want to talk for a few moments about the other pillars. The third pillar is almsgiving, and this is a traditional requirement of all people in Islam to the extent that you can do it. But it is not like an income tax, because an income tax taxes only what you earn in a particular year. So, for example, if you earn $50,000 in one year, you pay tax on $50,000. The next year, if you earn $50,000, you also pay tax just on the $50,000. But the almsgiving is based on your entire net worth. So, for example, if you make $50,000 one year and $50,000 in the next year, you have to pay a tax based on $100,000 because it's a tax on your net worth rather than what you have earned or come into possession of in any one particular year. And this giving is directed toward the poor, directed toward those who have little or nothing. Another of the pillars is fasting during the month of Ramadan. And the fast is to last from sunup to sundown. After sundown, you are allowed to take oftentimes a smaller meal, but sometimes after sundown there is a small celebration around the fact that you can eat for that particular time. And because Islam bases itself on a lunar calendar, the month of Ramadan shifts over the year. So that in some years, when it's closer to spring and summer, it becomes more difficult because the sun is around for longer during the day than it is when it occurs during November or December. The final pillar is the pilgrimage to Mecca. And I do have a marvelous video on that, but it lasts 24 minutes. So we're not going to deal with that today, and for the sake of time, I don't think I'm going to ask you to look at it in class for Tuesday as well, because we need to move on and talk a little bit at least about the last chapter. So at this point, I'm going to stop the recording.